We have a conversation today that's something I'm excited about. I've been a peace builder and an educator and a scholar for quite a few years, and more recently have become both someone interested in studying and being involved in nonviolent action and activism. And I think my colleague, Karen Ross, has been in the same boat. So we're going to talk today about some of what that's meant for us, how we've grappled with those intersections between peace building and nonviolent action, as well as between being scholars and practitioners and activists. So my name is Jeff Pugh. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance.
And I'm Karen Ross. I'm also an assistant professor in the Department of Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance. And as Jeff said, like him, I've also for many years been involved in peace building activities. And more recently, I've thought of myself less directly as in peace building and more in kind of the area of social change, for exactly the reason that a lot of my work is not just connected to kind of what we traditionally think of as peace building, but also to nonviolent action, both my research and my own work in the field as a practitioner, as an activist. So I'm also really excited about this conversation today.
Awesome. Well, Karen, I wonder if you can get us started by just going right into that. Tell us a little bit of your story. How have you gone through this trajectory of balancing or sort of evolution from one to the other, or grappling with the tensions between the world of peace building, the world of social change and activism, and their complementarities?
Sure. So my background, kind of both on the practitioner and the research side, is in education, and mostly in non-formal education. So education that doesn't happen in school settings, but happens, maybe after school programs or in within nonprofit or organizations or NGOs and so forth. And all of that work, the work that I've done in education as a practitioner and as a scholar, has been linked to educational programs that are trying to promote positive social change. I've done a lot of work in Israel with organizations that work with Jewish and Palestinian youth. So by Palestinian, in this case, I mean Palestinian citizens of Israel. And the organization that I've been working with most closely for the last decade is not an organization that considers itself a peace education or even a peace organization at this point. And so in a way, my own evolution has occurred kind of in tandem with the evolution of the work that is being done in the field, right? So the organization, the organization's name is Sadaka Reut. I've done a lot of work with them and written a lot about them as a scholar, and they're an organization that is really engaged in educating young people to be conscious of, aware of social injustices within Israeli society, and motivating them to work to change those injustices, to address all forms of discrimination, oppression, inequalities, and so forth. And I guess working with them has really made me think about, what does it mean to be building peace, right, through education or in grassroots work? And thinking about this kind of, I guess, the tension that I've heard, or the way I've heard it framed quite a bit, is, between peace and justice, right? So if you go to rallies and protests, especially kind of on the left, you hear often this slogan repeated: no justice, no peace, right? You can't have peace unless there is justice between groups. And so I really spent a lot of time thinking about that, and then thinking about it also within the kind of practitioner work that I do. For example, I do a lot of dialogue work, and that's something that raises a whole lot of questions about what does it mean to bring together groups in dialogue when there are significant power inequalities within participants in those groups, and what does it mean for how a facilitator should engage with the group? What does it mean for how the group should be structured? what does it mean for the need for kind of affinity groups or single group spaces within an intergroup dialogue? So, I mean, I guess, this isn't so much, it's a little bit of a linear trajectory in the sense that I started off thinking of myself as, kind of like a peace educator, and now no longer think of myself in that way. But I guess it's reflected in the kind of work I'm engaged in my community, the way I think about the work I'm doing in my community, and the way I've been even really framing and writing about the research that I do with organizations that are doing this kind of work. So, there's a lot more I think I could say there, but I'd love to hear your thoughts, Jeff.
Yeah, I had some similar things. I guess in my case, I definitely do still sort of frame myself as pursuing peace, think of myself, identify as a peace builder. But part of what I've done is pivot a bit. Early on, conflict resolution was the language that I used the most. And, my NGO that I created many years ago has conflict resolution in the name, right? And mediation is in the name. So it's all these tools like dialogue that are designed, and maybe even more than dialogue, with a sort of instrumental outcome. Let's have a point where this conflict is done and we move past it. And the more I sort of interacted with real people in real conflicts, I realized that's a sort of a superficial view of what actually happens. There's not usually a period and an end. And pretending or thinking that you're going to have a point where it's resolved and it's over misses some of the boat. And so it's more, I moved to the idea of pursuing peace as a sort of end point of the journey. But within the journey, it matters a lot what the sort of intermediary goals are. And preventing violence certainly is an important one. Preventing conflict, to me, is not a particularly important goal anymore, because conflict can be a sort of catalyst for change and something that pushes you for constructive movement. But preventing violence is good, and really centering the role of justice, that to pursue peace, you want to de-escalate conflicts, you want to prevent violence, and you want to increase sort of a just distribution of resources, of power, of lots of things. And so when I say peace, I am quite explicit that I no longer mean negative peace, no longer just mean the absence of violence. It really has to be more than that. Or you could have people not shooting, but in a really violent or oppressive situation, right? And so I came at this as I started, I also have a background in informal education around peace and conflict resolution. That's SIMPROC, my NGO's main focus is on training of grassroots level leaders in Latin America, and also children and others. And I guess I kept, as I was teaching people how to negotiate effectively, how to look for, getting beyond your initial position and look at the underlying interests. Those are important tools, and it helps to de-escalate a lot of conflicts that would otherwise not be de-escalated. But there are limits to what those sets of tools can do. And people kept asking, well, that's all well and good if both sides are committed to solving the problem. But what if one side benefits from the oppression? What if one side has no incentive to negotiate? Because why should they? They're more powerful. The other side can't defeat them. And, they're getting rich off the other side's slave labor or, lack of political power. So how can dialogue or mediation solve that? And the answer is they usually can't. Right. And so one way of doing that, other than just say, well, you just gotta, put it all on the table, whatever it takes to win, even if that's violence, even if that's, litigation or all kinds of less constructive tools. I started realizing that sometimes you got to escalate the conflict. Sometimes you have to change the status quo in a way that incentivizes the other side to talk to you and to negotiate. That's a prerequisite. Get enough justice or enough costs on the other side that they have an incentive to seek justice. And then negotiation comes in and the conflict resolution tools come in. On their own, they're just not enough. And so that's where I started learning more about the sort of whole rich field of nonviolent action that was already a burgeoning group. And so I helped to start a regional institute on nonviolent conflict in Latin America that brought together activists from all over the world, all over the region. And that's where I was both creating these platforms for trading experiences, but also learning myself. And, you know, I think that's an important way of doing this work, is sort of humbly receiving as well as giving, creating platforms and spaces, but not pretending that I'm an expert, sort of parachuting in and telling others how they should do it.
Right. Absolutely. And I think that's, you know, when I think about kind of the frameworks that you've been talking about and the terminology that we use, right? So, you know, we could think about the Galtung's framework of negative peace and positive peace, really resonating with this idea of kind of an end point, right? Of, you know, of what we want to see, in a sense that really encompasses justice, right? One of the other faculty members in our department talks about the kind of research that I do as about what makes peace sustainable. And I actually never really thought about it in that terms, but I do. Most of my research is about kind of the impact of these grassroots social change entities, initiatives, and so forth. And thinking about what you were saying just now, Jeff, really makes me think what makes it sustainable is not de-escalating conflict per se, but achieving, you know, a more equal power distribution or justice, you know, however you might define justice in a particular context, right? But that also is, I think, a real reminder that there aren't universal tools, right? That they're very contextual, and that we as scholars and even as practitioners really need to be humble about what we're bringing into other contexts that we might work in, or contexts that we're entering for the first time, or even not for the first time, right? That there's a lot that we need to learn, right? And that itself is also a reflection of, you know, some of the power issues that have kind of manifested in much bigger levels in contexts that are characterized by inequality and negative peace at best in some cases.
Absolutely. So sort of jumping on that, let's talk about that a little bit, this sort of tension between studying and learning about and offering frameworks and tools for resolving conflict versus being on the ground, knowing your context, knowing your conflict, and also the positionality, being directly affected by it, being someone who has lived it versus someone who's sort of observing from the outside. We know that there are shops around town, some very influential centers at universities and NGOs and others that have developed a stellar reputation as the experts in negotiation or conflict resolution. And they have best-selling books that they say, this is the answer that, you know, we can offer. And it's made a lot of good, right? It has helped people understand something. But there's a real risk of saying, you know, I'm a certified trainer at level 3 of this framework, and I can come in and help you. Often there is an opportunity to help, but it also creates a sort of hierarchy of expert talking to the locals and sort of guiding it, and a risk that the expert assumes that their knowledge is more valuable than the knowledge of that's contained within that community already. So, you know, we both do this. We are both people who study conflict, study nonviolent action, and are working closely on the ground with groups who are more directly affected. So how have you grappled with that sort of divide or that tension there?
I mean, I can give a couple examples. I don't think I have any great answers at the moment, but there's a couple of things that come to mind.
Examples maybe.
I mean, there's a couple of things that come to mind that I think have really just led me to reflect a lot more. So at a kind of scholarly level, a project that I've been involved with and kind of co-leading with Darren Pugh for the last 5 years is this project on essentially scaling up, the idea of how do we scale up peace building, and that really draws from the literature on civil resistance and nonviolent action. What can we learn from these movements that are using nonviolent action, that are engaged in civil resistance measures to help us understand what we can do as peace builders, right, to broaden the impact of our work. And one of the things that that was part of that project is one of the PhD students in our department, Charlotte Burnett, and I did an analysis of the literature on nonviolent action and civil resistance that dealt with scaling up in some way, shape, or form. And then I don't remember how many it was, but essentially literature from the field, manuals, guidelines for activists that were written by activists themselves, right, within their own organizations. And one of the things we found is that they're really talking about many different things, right? So the issues that are most important for the activists are not necessarily the issues that we as researchers are focusing on for whatever reason, because of what we could get funding to do, because of who we have access to, because of our own interests, right? And so, as we were doing this analysis and writing up, one of the things that we were thinking a lot about is what can we do to learn more from one another? And how can we do it in a more effective way? And I think, one of the, I said I don't have great answers, but I think one of the answers is actually doing what we're doing, right? There is often perceived to be a big disconnect between research, scholarship, academia, and what's happening on the ground. And I think to the extent that we as scholars are also involved in what's happening on the ground, not necessarily the exact things that we're researching, right, but that we're engaged in activism, that we're engaged in grassroots peace building, nonviolent action, and so forth. That lens really shapes also then the kinds of questions that we might ask about how to be effective, how we can increase our effectiveness or impact, or how we can recruit more individuals and so forth. I can say that as a practitioner, as an activist, I've thought a lot about what I've learned from the literature and how it might inform the kind of organizing that I'm involved in and so forth. And I've also thought a lot about, this issue that you raised, Jeff, with respect to hierarchies and kind of, establishing expertise and credentialing and so forth and what that means. This is slightly different than nonviolent action, but I've been doing a lot of work recently around restorative justice. And one of the things that I've been reading about that's led me to reflect a lot also is processes of restorative justice and then processes of transformative justice, and a feeling by many individuals who are really embedded in and committed to alternative frames of justice in their own communities that restorative justice has become kind of just another one of these industries that credentials people, and you get trained as a restorative justice facilitator, circle facilitator, or it's someone
branded.
Right, exactly. But then you have people who come in and I don't diminish the fact that people also need to make a living, right? But if it becomes about how you can get a job in the field, that also is very different from how are you involved directly in your own community, right? It's a different way of thinking about your role within that work. So, I think that's one of the tensions that I think about too, that as we learn more about it, as we develop expertise in the field, either from reading the literature and kind of deepening our knowledge of what people have already written, or by talking with people and so forth, you know, how much of that in some ways is also leading a little bit to this disjuncture between what is contextually effective and what is perceived for whatever reasons as expertise, knowledge, legitimacy, and so forth. So it's been, I don't know, it's like
that
just something I've been grappling with.
I'm sorry, you're just popping like thoughts in my head, because what you're talking about is almost like a commodification of conflict resolution knowledge that, as you say, it's not to disparage it. It's not good or bad, because people who are engaged in this work need to make a living as well. And it needs to be high quality, which means well-prepared training, and that has costs attached to it, because if you do it badly, it's going to diminish the reputation of the whole field, and people aren't going to want to do it anymore. That's all true. And the more that we professionalize the field, the more we focus on making sure that we have professionals who are well paid to provide a service, and the output of that service is resolved conflicts, the less we pay attention to the connections between that action of knowledge sharing and skill building and the context in which it's received. And, drawing on Paulo Freire and others, it loses its reciprocity. It loses the essential nature, the almost democratizing nature of the back and forth. And I can own the fact that I went through that trajectory, because early on, that's what I was doing, to be frank. I was saying, we need to give this knowledge, these tools, to as many people as we can, so that they'll resolve their conflict more effectively. Mm-hmm. And that's not a bad thing to do. For those people, it probably made a difference. But I'm not so sure that having a structure like that does much to scale up the impact of change even to a community level, much less, a country or a system. And I had an early experience or two where I was asked to be part of a mediation commission going into, for example, an indigenous village in Ecuador. And I was not in charge. I didn't get to set the rules. I was supposed to be there sort of providing expert sage guidance or something. But the person who was in charge sort of used the tools they were used to of giving a speech and then saying, okay, who's the leader on your side? We'll hear your speech. And then let me tell you what the outcome is going to be, right? So almost like a arbitration, and it didn't work. Indigenous culture is all about, community reciprocity, and there's not one leader that gets to speak for all of us. We all speak. And if that takes 4 hours, it's going to take 4 hours. And it just really didn't work. And I was uncomfortable, but didn't feel like I was the one who got to be in charge. But what I should have done is insist on more conversation in the planning, so that I would know if I should go or not, if I should be a part of it. Later on, I was very influenced by a famous article. I think it was Koyan Hedin, who wrote this thing on the community mediation movement in the United States, because I got my start in community mediation. But again, I was thinking of it in terms of those sort of providing a service, giving these tools. And they said that the power of it being the community mediation movement is you draw mediators from the same community, the neighbors, the people who are right there with the parties in conflict. That you're explicitly rejecting this idea of outside experts coming in and solving it for you. And a lot of community mediation centers struggle with that, because the people with some time are like richer, white, retired people, for example. Right. And the communities that they're serving are not those things. And so, the one that I served in Baltimore, the Community Mediation Center, was very intentional about who they selected, who they allowed to go through the free training. They would actually, go out of their way to find folks who lived in lots of parts of the city, represented a wide diversity, gender, race, class background, etc. And they would, Laurie Charkodian, who founded the place and is now actually in the Maryland legislature, did research showing that it mattered a lot for participants' empowerment, their satisfaction, if the mediators reflected them, right? If you had two Black women who were the subjects or participants, and you had two white male mediators, they're going to be less satisfied. And especially if you had one white male or two white male mediators, one white participant and one Black participant, that Black person is gonna really, trust the process less. So you really have to have this sort of reciprocal community social capital brought into the mediation setting. You can't sort of think of it as a bubble on its own. And that is related to movement building, that's related to organizing, that seeing these tools as completely hermetically sealed, I think does our field a disservice.
Absolutely. And I think at the same time, it also shows, in some sense, I think when we talk about social movements and we think about these huge movements that exist to change, the kind of one that's most foregrounded in the United States right now is probably Black Lives Matter, right? As a movement or a network or whatever you want to call it, right? It's not, and it identifies itself as a leaderful movement. It is not led by a single person, but, communities have kind of, it's like nodes, right? And a bigger network. And it says something also about, when we think about it with respect to peace building, I think in the peace building field, there has been consensus for a long time that peace building is contextual, that it's local, that it needs to be kind of community driven, right? But I think one of the things that we can think of and learn from social movements writ large or nonviolent action in its macro kind of broader sense is how to connect those nodes, how to connect those kind of very local contexts in a way that can broaden the effectiveness of these tools, right? So they're not hermetically sealed, as you say. They have their use, right? Within, I think, a much broader range of strategies, ideas, concepts, relationships, and maybe most saliently relationships that can help transform communities and hopefully potentially societies as well. But it's certainly, one of the reasons also that I think, I didn't ever identify myself as a conflict resolution practitioner per se, but I think it's very slippery thinking about how we use these terms, and what they signal, especially in the field, on the ground, among activists within their local communities, especially in context of who we are as both activists ourselves and scholars, who by virtue of our positions, right, have a certain kind of, way in which we're perceived also.
Yeah. And I guess that's the last thing I want to bring up is this, how can you be a scholar and do the things that the field tells us you need to do in order to do good scholarship, and still sort of do no harm, sort of be still moving towards peace as your goal. I think in my work, in both my research and in my practice, relationships are kind of the key centering drive. And that actually is a particular type of doing research that is not the dominant one, and in fact is disparaged in some circles, right? That I think the myth of scientific objectivity can be a real barrier to doing good peace work. And the idea is that you are out back here behind a screen observing. If you insert yourself into the world that you're studying, you're going to change it, you're going to bias it. The results that you report out are invalid. And if you don't, then they're sort of scientifically sanctimony or
valid.
Yeah, valid. And I've struggled with that because, as an example, I wrote an article sort of grappling with some of these issues, but for a more popular press newspaper op-ed about the long-standing and intense nonviolent campaign in a particular Latin American country. And the United States was increasingly meddling and actually was allying with the movement, but I was skeptical of the motives of some of the leaders who were doing that. And so I wrote this article saying, if you want to help this country and the nonviolent movement there, take your cues from the leaders of the movement itself. Talk to them, ask them, what would help, instead of saying, here's what we need to do to make this country's, evil regime get out of there. And so I used my platform. I had been invited to do this op-ed because I was a fancy professor with a PhD and they had heard of me. But I used that platform to essentially say, I'll help be your secretary, write it up for you. But please, you say, what would you like the U.S. to do to help you? And my article was sprinkled throughout with in-depth quotes from the activists that I had met through this Nonviolent Action Institute that we founded, a platform that was sort of a peacebuilding or social change platform. And so we had already invested in those relationships over time. I get sort of WhatsApp messages from the group that went through that program. And as a result, we had this trust. And then when I got a platform, I offered it to them and said, I don't know. I could say what I think based on the literature, but I want to know what you would like to say. And then now that's out there, and people in the U.S. Probably not influenced by it, but at least they could read it if they wanted.
Right.
And that was important to me to do that.
Yeah, and that really resonates with kind of how I've evolved as just a researcher myself. Mm-hmm. So I have this. This was never me, but I have this memory when I started my PhD of my partner saying, "Oh, you're going to quantify the impact of peace around the world," or something like that. And, it was very clear to me very quickly that was not what I was interested in doing. And in the last...
There's a push to do it.
What?
There is a big push to do it.
There absolutely is, but that's not me, right? So, and I think, this language of relationships and the significance of relationship building has really... is always something that's been important to me, but is something that over the years has really shaped how I think about what my research should be focused on and whose voices should be heard through that research. And has really shifted me actually to thinking much more about participatory approaches to learning, and kind of internal learning processes, right? That I think also that are a way of thinking about how the field and research, right, in this field can perhaps learn from each other, right? So, just an example of is, again, this is more related to the restorative justice work that I'm doing than to nonviolent action per se, but prior to things getting shut down before COVID, for the last few years, I've been involved in a project in one of the correctional institutes in Massachusetts, looking at the kind of the impact of restorative justice programming there. Mm-hmm. And I was very clear when I was invited to do this research that I was not the person with the expertise to really do it, right? So what we did actually was create kind of a participatory research group. And I brought certain expertise to the process in terms of thinking about how we might research it, what methods we could use, like what learning processes might help us understand the impact of this project. But I certainly don't have any expertise about what it's like to either experience this restorative justice program, to experience living in the correctional institute, you know, being incarcerated in the correctional institute, and so forth. And so I think, you know, and this was also, it's a lot of relationship building. It's a lot of working together to figure out, how can we do this? What should we do? And then who's our audience, right? That's another question. I think that's something that really we all need to be thinking about as scholars in this field. Is our audience just other scholars? Or if we want our research to be read by, you know, as you're saying, you wrote for a popular press, not for academic press, then who's reading it? And then whose voices really matter in that? So, you know, I think that's really kind of framed the way I approach my academic work at this point. And, you know, I think also moving towards or thinking about the future and the kind of work that I want to do, I'm far less interested than I once was in kind of researching the impact of peace building initiatives in so-and-so conflict region, right, and much more thinking about what is the work that is being done that I'm connected to, and how can the skills that I have potentially be of use to those initiatives if I'm invited in, right? So not kind of pushing myself into the process as someone who should be listened to in some way, shape, or form, but, you know. So, you know, I think a lot of transformation personally, professionally, and so forth over the last, you know, the period of time in which I've been doing this work.
Yeah. So such a healthy approach. Let's all keep an openness to change and right, not assume that we're there. Well, thank you, Karen. This has been so wonderful and a constructive conversation that hopefully will spark others, will inspire others to do some reflection. It can sometimes be uncomfortable to hold up a mirror and think, you know, where are we? What things still need changing? But hopefully this will be a start.
Right, absolutely. And thank you for inviting me to do it. It is even just the process of talking about it now is a little bit of a mirror and thinking about, you know, what further change we need to aspire to.
Absolutely awesome.